By the first week of May 1945, Herbert Karl had been manning the same MG-42 position in the forests south of Saldus for 11 days without relief. He was 22 years old. He had been on the Eastern Front since 1942. He had fought at Leningrad, survived the retreat through Estonia, and ended up here on a low ridge in western Latvia with his gun team of 3 men, watching the same tree line to the east every morning and waiting for the Soviet infantry to come out of it again. They came in waves. That is the thing people do not understand about the Eastern Front in 1945. The Red Army was not desperate by then. It was methodical, confident, and enormous. The men who came out of that tree line were well-fed, well-equipped, and knew they were winning. They advanced in long lines across open ground, 200 meters of frozen mud between the forest and the German positions, and Karl's job was to cut those lines apart before they reached the wire. The MG-42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. The Germans called it the Hitlersäge, Hitler's saw. At that rate of fire, you burned through a belt of 250 rounds in 12 seconds, and then you were reloading while the lines kept coming. If your loader was slow, you were dead. Kyle's loader was not slow. He had been doing it for 3 years. When the first line broke and the men fell and the second line came out of the trees anyway, Karl did not think about what that meant. There was no time to think about what it meant. You kept the gun fed and you kept it on the line, and you watched for the men who dropped into shell craters and got back up. On May 8th, 1945, a runner came through the trees behind Karl's position with a message from battalion. Berlin had fallen 8 days ago. Hitler was dead. Germany had signed its surrender. The war in Europe was over. Karl read the message. He passed it to his loader. His loader read it and put it in his pocket. They could see movement at the edge of the tree line. Karl got back behind the gun. The last German soldier in the Courland pocket formally surrendered on May 22nd, 1945. The war had been over for 14 days. Last week I was talking to one of my viewers. He has been helping me with a manuscript translation for an upcoming project, and we got talking, and he mentioned his grandfather had been in Courland. He sent me a photograph and a letter. I'm not going to say what the letter said. But looking at that photograph, I went back to the books, spent the last few weeks reading everything I could find on this, and I want to show you what I found because this is one of the most brutal and most overlooked stories of the entire Second World War. Not just because of the battles, because of what brought those men to that peninsula in the first place. Before there was a Courland pocket, there was Latvia. That matters. If you do not understand what happened to Latvia in a single night in June 1941, nothing that follows will make sense. Not the fighting, not the ferocity, not the men who chose the forests over surrender. Latvia declared independence on November 18th, 1918. The 22 years that followed were not perfect, but they were Latvian. A functioning government, a national language taught in national schools, land reform that distributed estates from Baltic German nobility to Latvian farmers who had worked that soil for generations without ever owning it. A country of 2 million people that existed, was governed by its own people, and had a national anthem that was actually played. On August 23rd, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The public text was a non-aggression agreement. The secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania fell to the Soviet sphere. The Baltic governments were not consulted. They were not informed. They were allocated. On the 17th of June 1940, Soviet forces crossed the Latvian border. Latvia's President Karlis Ulmanis was placed under arrest and liable to prompt liquidation. Immediate execution was ordered for any diplomat abroad who refused to recognize the new regime. Rigged elections installed an assembly that voted to join the USSR. On August 5th, 1940, Latvia ceased to exist as a sovereign state and became the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. The NKVD moved in immediately. Their mandate was the elimination of anyone who might form the nucleus of future resistance. Politicians, military officers, lawyers, teachers, priests, landowners, anyone who had held any position of authority in the previous republic. Over 3,745 arrests and approximately 400 executions in 1940 alone. By mid-1941, approximately 18,000 to 20,000 Latvians had been arrested on political grounds. Executions in the thousands, often without trial, often in NKVD cellars in the middle of the night. The Latvians gave this period a name, Baigais Gads, the Year of Terror. Then came the night of the 14th of June, 1941. 8 days before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered the largest single operation of mass deportation in Baltic history. The NKVD had been compiling its lists for months. The operation had an official title: Resolution on the Eviction of the Socially Foreign Elements from the Baltic Republics. The socially foreign elements were lawyers, teachers, army officers, former government officials, landowners, and their wives and children. People were woken in the night and given less than 1 hour to pack. Whatever they could not carry was confiscated on the spot. They were taken to railway stations in trucks and loaded into cattle cars already waiting on the tracks. At the station, the head of the family was separated from his wife and children. The official NKVD instruction was explicit on this point. It stated that the convoy of the entire family to the station shall be effected in one vehicle, and only at the station of departure shall the head of the family be placed separately from his family in a car specially intended for heads of families. The families were told they were being moved together. They were not told what was happening until the train was moving and the platform was behind them. Approximately 15,500 Latvians were taken that night. Among them were 2,400 children under the age of 10. The men, around 5,263 of them, went directly to Gulag hard labor camps in Siberia. The women and children were sent to administrative settlements in Kazakhstan and the Arctic as family members of enemies of the people. Around 5,000 of the total deportees died in exile, on the journey, or were executed before the war ended. 1% of Latvia's entire population, removed from their homes, separated from their families, loaded into cattle cars, in a single night. The NKVD had documented plans to deport several 100,000 more Latvians in late July 1941. Germany's invasion interrupted those plans. On June 22, 1941, 8 days after the June deportations, the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border along a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North drove north through the Baltic states. German forces entered Riga on July 1, 1941, 2 weeks into the invasion. With the memory of the deportation night still raw, with the cattle cars still somewhere east of the Urals, Latvians greeted the German troops as liberators. The Latvian national anthem played on the radio for the first time in a year. Anti-Soviet resistance groups that had been hiding in the forests during the Year of Terror emerged and fought alongside the advancing Germans. The men who had watched their fathers loaded into cattle cars at railway platforms had a specific and personal relationship with the Soviet forces now retreating eastward. This was not an abstract ideological enemy. These were the people who had done that. Some of the Latvians who joined German organised formations in the summer of 1941 did so out of genuine ideological conviction. Most were doing what men do when a force that has destroyed their families offers them weapons and a direction to point them. The Latvian Legion was formally established in January 1943 after the German defeat at Stalingrad created a manpower crisis acute enough that Himmler secured Hitler's permission to form Waffen-SS divisions from the Baltic populations. The 15th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS and the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS formed its core. A total of 140,000 Latvians served in German formations of one kind or another during the war. The commander of the 15th Division reported to his superiors on January 27, 1945, as Soviet forces were closing around Courland. They are first and foremost Latvians. They want a sustainable Latvian nation-state. Forced to choose between Germany and Russia, they have chosen Germany because they seek cooperation with Western civilization. The rule of the Germans seems to them to be the lesser of two evils. He was correct. They were not fighting for Hitler. They were fighting against what had taken their fathers to Siberia. The Nuremberg Tribunal, in its 1946 ruling classifying the Waffen-SS as a criminal organization, specifically exempted those who had been forcibly conscripted and ruled that those serving in the Baltic legions were conscripts rather than volunteers. In 1950, the United States government declared the Baltic Waffen-SS units to be separate and distinct in purpose, ideology, activities and qualifications for membership from the German SS and not to be considered a movement hostile to the government of the United States. Now to the pocket. On the 22nd of June 1944, 3 years to the day after Germany launched Barbarossa, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, the largest single Soviet offensive of the entire war. Directed against Army Group Center in Belarusia, it committed 2.4 million men, 5,200 tanks, and 5,300 aircraft against a German force that had been starved of reinforcements because Hitler refused to believe the attack would fall where Soviet planners had specifically designed it to fall. Army Group Center was not pushed back. It was destroyed. 28 divisions were shattered or encircled in the first 2 weeks. German casualties in the first month numbered 350,000 to 400,000 killed, wounded, or captured. It opened a gap in the German line the Soviet armoured spearheads drove through at a speed the German command had no capacity to address. In the final stages of the offensive, Soviet tank formations swung northwest toward the Baltic coast. On October 10th, 1944, units of the Soviet 51st Army reached the Baltic Sea near the town of Memel. The last land corridor connecting Army Group North to the rest of the German forces was cut. 33 divisions of Army Group North were isolated on the Courland Peninsula in western Latvia. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers and 20,000 Latvians in the 15th and 19th Waffen-SS Grenadier Divisions had the Baltic Sea to their north and west, Soviet forces to their south and east, and no land route home. The Latvians called it Kurzemes Kettles, the Kurland Kettle. Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner commanded Army Group North. He had assembled a force of 3 panzer divisions, the 4th, 12th and 14th, with the intention of launching Operation Gaia Vulture, a breakout through Soviet lines toward Memel, planned for the 17th of October. The Soviets launched their own offensive 2 days before Gaia was meant to begin, and the German armour assembled for the breakout was committed instead to stopping the Soviet attack. The pocket was sealed. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, immediately argued for evacuation by sea. The Baltic Fleet could move men through the ports of Liepaja and Ventspils. The troops were intact, still combat effective, and redeployed to the Central Front. They could stiffen the German line against the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive that Guderian correctly predicted was coming in January 1945. Hitler's answer was the same every time. The army group will stay where it is. He still believed Courland could serve as a springboard for a new offensive against Leningrad. He believed Admiral Donitz's new type of U-boats would turn the Battle of the Atlantic. He named the encirclement Festung Kurland, Fortress Courland, and ordered it held. Schörner implemented the order with a specific kind of fanaticism. He banned the word pocket from use within Army Group North. Any soldier who referred to the encirclement as a pocket rather than a bridgehead risked a firing squad. He had men shot for retreating without orders. He had soldiers hung from trees with signs around their necks declaring them cowards. His own men called him the executioner of Courland. The official term became the Courland bridgehead, to create the impression that the 200,000 trapped men were on the verge of a breakout, rather than digging into a swamp. Gottlob Biedermann, an officer in the 132nd Infantry Division who survived the entire pocket, and wrote the most detailed first-hand memoir of the fighting there, recorded what the men actually thought when Hitler awarded Schörner the diamonds to his Knight's Cross. The strength and resolve of the men in the trenches could by no means be credited to the General Oberst with the Golden Party Badge. The attributes, the will to resist, and the sacrifices made had been instilled in the individual soldier in the 3.5 years of war the division had faced on the battlefields of southern and northern Russia. The terrain of Courland made it simultaneously hellish to survive in and almost impossible to attack. The peninsula was a patchwork of forest, bog, river and farmland that neutralized the Soviet advantages in armour and artillery. Tanks could not manoeuvre freely through the swamps. Artillery preparation chewed up the already compromised ground without creating firm footing for advancing infantry. A Soviet signalman in the Estonian 8th Rifle Corps described the problem plainly. The situation there was impossible since the entire Courland region was a continuous swamp. In order for our hardware to pass, we had to lay down special tracks right on the swampy ground. Without them, there was no way our hardware could pass. When a mortar gun got stuck, we had to pull out the 122mm mortar shells and then mount the mortar on timber blocks in order to fire it again. The same terrain that frustrated Soviet armour gave German and Latvian infantry something to work with. The forests provided cover, the river lines provided natural defensive barriers, the bogs channeled attacking forces into corridors that could be pre-registered with artillery and covered with interlocking machine gun fire. For the men inside, the conditions were unlike anything they had experienced elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Combat conditions were brutal, supplies limited by what could be brought in by sea under Soviet Baltic Fleet interdiction. Many soldiers suffered from dysentery throughout the winter from the contaminated groundwater in the trenches. By November, the water in many positions reached a man's thighs. The men slept standing because lying down meant your face went under. The bodies of Soviet soldiers killed in the last attack floated in the mud for days because the artillery never stopped long enough to retrieve them. The temperature dropped to -20 in December. The water in the trenches froze around their legs overnight. When the Soviet guns opened up before an assault, the frozen ground shattered like glass, and the men who had not been hit by the shells were buried in it. The nights in the pocket were a different kind of horror. During the long winter nights from 4 in the afternoon to 9 in the morning, the forward positions existed in total darkness, broken only by artillery flashes and the occasional illumination flare. Soviet night patrols moved through the wire, looking for gaps. German and Latvian night patrols moved out to meet them. These were not operations planned at divisional level. They were 6-man actions, sometimes 4 men, creeping through swamp and frozen forest in complete darkness, knowing that anyone who made a sound was dead. Men used knives and sharpened entrenching tools rather than rifles because a single gunshot would bring everything down on the patrol's position. The men who came back described the specific terror of moving through total darkness in frozen mud, knowing that somewhere within 10 meters there was another patrol moving toward you and that the next sound you heard might be the last one. The men who did not come back were added to the count that the divisional intelligence officers maintained with a bureaucratic precision that had its own particular horror. The sound of the MG-42 in the Courland forests was different from the open steppe. In open country, the sound dissipated across distance. In the forests, it bounced from the trees and came back distorted, and the men close to the gun could hear nothing for minutes afterward. Hand signals, pre-arranged sequences of gestures for the gun team that had been developed across years of Eastern Front fighting and never written down, because the men who needed them had simply absorbed them. The loader fed the belt without being told because he had done it 10,000 times. When a jam happened, which it did in the cold and mud of Courland more than anywhere else, the 3 men cleared it in silence and darkness by touch. The gun had to come back up before the next line reached the wire. Mikhail Saltykov, commander of a machine gun platoon of the Estonian 8th Rifle Corps, attacking the German positions, described what his men encountered when they managed to breach the outer line. We would overrun one trench, but then would immediately come across another line of trenches, and it seemed there was no end to them. The Germans and Latvians had been digging since October. The entire pocket was a layered defensive system of trenches, bunkers, wire and minefields, constructed by men who knew they were never going to advance, and therefore built defences as if they intended to live in them forever. The supply situation was a constant crisis. Every night that weather and Soviet naval activity permitted, small convoys of Kriegsmarine vessels crossed the Baltic from German ports to Liepāja and Ventspils. Ships were sunk, crews drowned. The cargoes that got through were a fraction of what was needed. A Kriegsmarine lieutenant who commanded one of the supply vessels described the Baltic crossings in winter as the worst operations of his naval career, which had included the Norwegian campaign and the Atlantic. The Baltic in winter was violent water in a confined space with specific and known threats from mines, submarines, and aircraft. Each crossing was potentially the last one. By January 1945, the average German soldier in Courland was receiving rations that would have been considered starvation levels in any prisoner of war camp the Wehrmacht operated. Horses were eaten when the horses could no longer be kept alive. By the final months, the cavalry divisions had eaten their horses and were fighting on foot. The medical situation inside the pocket deteriorated in direct proportion to the supply situation. Field hospitals established in Latvian farmhouses were overwhelmed from the first major battle and never recovered. Surgeons operated without adequate anaesthetic from the 3rd month onward. Wound infections that would have been controlled with penicillin in a properly supplied field hospital became gangrenous in Courland because the penicillin convoys kept being sunk. Amputations increased as a proportion of all surgical procedures because the alternative, attempting to save a limb without the antibiotics to prevent infection, frequently meant losing the man. The surgeons recorded their caseloads with German precision. The records were sent to Schörner's headquarters with requests for additional medical supplies. The requests were acknowledged and not filled. The artillery on both sides defined the fighting more than any other weapon. The Soviet Leningrad front had approximately 600,000 troops available by early 1945. coordinated through multiple armies including the 4th Shock Army, the 6th Guards Army, the 42nd Army, and the 51st Army. Each offensive was preceded by a preparation that lasted hours and in some cases an entire day. A Soviet artillery officer who fought in the second battle described the experience from the other side of the wire. His battery fired over 1,000 rounds on a single day in November, he said, and when the smoke cleared and his forward observer reported through the telephone, the German line was still there. His men went silent when he told them. They had been certain after the bombardment that nothing could be alive in those positions. The next morning, the Germans counterattacked and pushed back the Soviet infantry that had occupied the forward trenches. The counterattack was led by Latvian soldiers from the 19th Division, who knew the ground because they had built the positions themselves. The Germans and Latvians had learned early to abandon the forward positions during the preparation and pull back to the second line, then counterattack into the Soviet infantry as it crossed the captured forward positions. This elastic defense frustrated Soviet commanders, who had calibrated their artillery to destroy the forward positions and found them empty on arrival. The men who were supposed to be dead were 50 meters behind them in a second trench, and the men who had just taken the first trench were now in the open between the two lines, which was exactly where the German artillery had been registered to fire. The Soviet casualties from this pattern of fighting were catastrophic on multiple occasions. A German lieutenant named Karl Obermeier of the 21st Infantry Division described a counterattack during the Third Battle of Courland in a letter to his father that was preserved in a private archive. His platoon had been in the second line when the Soviet artillery preparation ended and the infantry crossed their abandoned forward trench. He waited for the signal, a single red flare from the platoon on his right. When the flare went up, he led his men forward through the forest 60 meters to the tree line, then across the open ground toward the first trench. The Soviet infantry who had just taken it were still settling into it when the German counterattack came across the open ground. Obermeier wrote that the next 5 minutes were the most violent of his life, and he had been fighting since 1941. He did not describe the specific violence, he described the counting afterward. 11 German soldiers had crossed the open ground, 9 reached the trench, 2 were dead in the open between the positions. His platoon had retaken the first trench. The Soviet infantry had withdrawn into the forest. He wrote to his father that he did not know what they would do when the next attack came because he had 6 men and half a magazine of ammunition. Soviet forces launched 6 major offensives against the Courland pocket between October 15th, 1944 and April 4th, 1945. Each one was larger than the previous engagement at the same location. Each one failed to break through. The First Battle of Courland ran from 15th to 22nd October 1944. The Soviet objective was the destruction of the trapped German force before it could consolidate its positions. In the central sector, 3 German infantry divisions held off 13 Soviet divisions. The 4th, 12th and 14th Panzer divisions were thrown into the defensive fighting to plug the gaps. Panzer Commander Sergeant First Class Hermann Bix had just returned from a military hospital recovering from a mortar wound. He selected a new crew for his Panther tank and drove straight into the fighting south of Saldus, leading a rescue mission to reach 2 Panthers stuck in a wooded ravine under direct fire. Bix reached his comrades in the dead of night, guided by the sound of their engines, and pulled them out under shell fire. The attack was stopped. The pocket held for the first time and the lines began to harden into something resembling permanence. The second battle ran from 27th October to 25th November. The Red Army launched coordinated attacks to cut off the port of Liepaja on the Baltic coast. At one point during this battle, the Soviet command threw 52 divisions simultaneously at the German lines, 52 divisions against a force of 33. The 205th Infantry Division, fighting south of Saldus, repulsed 6 separate Soviet divisions during this phase. When his reserves ran out, the divisional commander, Major General Gysi, fed his clerks, radiomen, medics and drivers into the front line because there was no one else left. Soviet tanks bogged down in a deluge of rain that turned the ground into a quagmire, and the German infantry held what the Soviet armour could not reach. Sergeant Anatoly Krasov of the Soviet 291st Rifle Division operated a Maxim machine gun during the second battle. His team had been in the same position for 4 days when the order came to move up in support of an infantry assault near Kurland. They moved the gun through forest for 2 hours, 4 men carrying the weapon and 1 man carrying the ammunition boxes. When they reached the tree line and set up, the infantry assault had already begun. Krasov could see the German positions 300 meters across the open ground, and he could see the German MG-42 on the right flank, cutting lines in the attacking infantry. He traversed his gun to the right and fired at the German position. The German gun stopped for approximately 30 seconds, then it started again from a different position. The German crew had moved while he was firing. He traversed and fired again. The German gun stopped again. He never knew whether he hit the crew or simply suppressed them. The infantry attack failed anyway. His crew dug in at the tree line and waited for the next order. By the end of November, both sides had fought themselves to a bloody standstill. The Soviets had inflicted another 33,000 casualties on the German force and had pushed them slightly closer to the Baltic. They had not broken through. The third battle in December was contained after initial Soviet gains. The fourth battle began on January 24th, 1945. German forces, including the 4th, 12th and 14th Panzer Divisions, repelled the Soviet assault near Kurland through coordinated counterattacks that exploited Soviet overextension after the initial artillery barrage. The result was approximately 40,000 Soviet casualties, the destruction of 541 tanks, and 178 aircraft lost in less than a week of fighting. The Germans retook lost ground and pushed back to the original line. A Soviet lieutenant who participated in the fourth battle described the counterattack that rolled back his regiment's gains on the third day. The German tanks came out of the forest at dawn. We could hear them before we could see them, the sound of the tracks in the frozen ground. We had no anti-tank weapons in the forward positions. The men with anti-tank rifles were behind us. We ran. Not all of us made it back through the open ground before the tanks reached the trench we had been holding. He counted his survivors when the counterattack ended. Of 48 men who had gone into the forward trench that morning, 19 came back. He requested reinforcements. He received a message from regiment telling him to hold with what he had. The 5th battle in February and early March. The 6th battle in late March and early April, which the Soviets launched and then effectively abandoned when they concluded that the effort required to destroy the pocket was not worth diverting from the assault on Berlin. By April 1945, Soviet soldiers jokingly called the blockaded Army Group North a camp for armed POWs. The pocket had been reduced to something closer to a very large and heavily armed prison than a fighting force with any strategic purpose. The men inside the pocket did not experience it as a footnote. Biderman wrote about what kept the men fighting in the final months, when the strategic situation had been obvious for a year. It was widely accepted within the ranks of those fighting in the East that death on the battlefield was preferable to an unknown destiny in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. This mentality often played a role in the many acts of bravery demonstrated by individuals or entire units. During the closing days of the war, it was not at all uncommon for entire companies, battalions, and battle groups to fight to the last man, the survivors going into captivity only when ammunition was exhausted and wounds were too grave to allow further resistance. The men who survived the 6 battles described Courland in terms that always returned to the same qualities: the cold, the mud, the noise, the specific quality of noise in a forest under artillery bombardment, which was not the open thunder of the steppe, but a confined and layered sound, each shell finding the tree canopy before the ground, the explosion directed downward in a cone of shrapnel through the branches, killing men in open positions who would have survived the same shell in the open. Men dug deeper. They built overhead cover from the timber that was everywhere in Courland. They lived underground during bombardments and came up afterward to count who had not come up. A medical officer attached to the 215th Infantry Division wrote in a report to divisional headquarters in December 1944 that the psychological condition of his patients had shifted qualitatively from previous campaigns. The men he was treating were not afraid of death, he wrote. They had been afraid of death for 3.5 years, and they had used that fear up. What remained after fear was a specific emptiness that he had not encountered before. They fought with mechanical competence. They were not cowards. They were men who had gone beyond the reach of conventional military medicine and were operating from some reserve that had no clinical name. He recommended iron rations and longer sleep rotations. He knew neither was available. The letters that were sent home in the final months were characterized by their brevity. the divisional postal officer for the 215th Infantry Division noted in a report that the volume of outgoing mail had dropped by 70% between October 1944 and February 1945, while the number of men in the division had decreased by only 40%. The men who were still alive were writing less and less. Some stopped writing because they could not find anything to say that was true and that could be written and sent. Some stopped because writing required something they no longer had. One Latvian soldier who did not desert was a man named Juris Abelins of the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division. He had been drafted in 1943, had fought at Narva in February 1944, and was in Courland from October 1944 until the surrender. He was interviewed by a Latvian-Canadian historian in 1978. "We knew the war was ending," Abelins said. "We had known for months, everyone knew. What we did not know was what came after. If the Soviets won, Latvia would be a Soviet republic. We had seen what that meant in 1 year of occupation, and it was worse than anything the Germans had done. There was no good outcome for Latvia. There had not been a good outcome available since August 1939. What we were doing in those trenches was buying time. For what, we were not certain. We kept buying it because the alternative was to stop." Soviet loudspeakers on the other side of the wire played Latvian folk songs and broadcast entreaties from sisters and fiancés pleading for men to come home. Some Latvian soldiers wept, a few deserted, most stayed. In one 24-hour period during the winter fighting, a Latvian company commander named Captain Mievaldis Adamsons repelled 7 separate Soviet assaults on his position south of Saldus. When the last assault broke and the Soviet infantry pulled back across the frozen ground, Adamson sent men out to count the bodies. They counted 400 Soviet soldiers in front of his lines. His company was still holding when Germany surrendered in May 1945. He was one of the men who went into the forest rather than lay down his weapon. Soviet rifleman Nikolai Voronov of the 22nd Guards Rifle Division described an assault during the 5th battle that his platoon made against a Latvian-held position in the forests east of Saldus in February 1945. They crossed open ground under mortar fire. The man to his left was hit and went down hard. The man to his right kept running. Voronov ran and did not look at either of them. When they reached the tree line and found the German trench abandoned, his platoon sergeant counted heads. 7 men had made it across. The platoon had started the day with 23. Voronov said he sat in the abandoned trench and could not move for several minutes. His sergeant told him to get up. He got up. An hour later, the Latvians counterattacked and they ran back across the same open ground the other way. The pocket survived the winter. It survived the spring. It was still intact when Hitler shot himself in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945. It was still intact when Germany signed the instrument of surrender on May 8th, 1945. Army Group Courland was in a communications blackout. The surrender order did not reach them until May 10th. 2 days after the war ended, they were still fighting. The final weeks of the pocket, from late April to 22nd May, were fought by men who had received the news of Hitler's death on 30th April, the news of Germany's surrender on May 10th, and who were still receiving orders from Schörner's headquarters to hold their positions. Some units interpreted the surrender order as a directive to lay down their weapons immediately. Others received the order, acknowledged it, and continued fighting for hours or days because the alternative was to walk across open ground towards Soviet positions and hope that the men on the other side had received the same order and had already stopped. In the confusion of the final days, some men were killed after the official end of hostilities by opponents who had not yet received the word, or who had received it and did not trust it. The last combat death in the Courland pocket is not precisely documented. It happened sometime in the week after the war officially ended. On the evening of May 9th, 1945, Soviet Marine infantryman Pavel Klimov was moving along the western coast of Latvia with his unit when the German trenches ahead of them erupted in celebration. He halted his men. He thought it was a trap. It was not. Germany had surrendered. The men in those trenches had just found out. Klimov and his unit learned about it from the fireworks going up over the German positions. We were proceeding along the shore and couldn't understand the commotion and jubilation along the German trenches. It turned out that they had learned that the war had ended. We learned from the fireworks and the firing in the air that it was over. Only then did we receive an order by radio to abort the operation. There was a lot of joy. Not for everyone. For the Latvian soldiers in those trenches, the end of the German war meant the beginning of something else. The Soviets were back. The same force that had loaded their families into cattle cars in June 1941 was now the occupying power of their country for the second time. General Karl Hilpert, the last commander of Army Group Courland, surrendered to Marshal Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad Front, at Ezia Manor in southwest Latvia, on May 9, 1945. He sent a final message to his troops before surrendering. He died in Soviet captivity in 1947. Schörner, the man who had hung soldiers from trees with signs around their necks, who had had men shot for calling this place a pocket, fled by light aircraft to Austria before the surrender was complete. He dressed in civilian clothes, he was captured by American forces, he was tried by the Soviets, sentenced to 25 years for war crimes, and released in 1955. In West Germany, he was later convicted of unlawfully executing German soldiers and served until 1963. He died in Munich in 1973. The men he left behind in those Latvian forests did not mostly live that long. From 9th to 12th May alone, the Soviets recorded the surrender of 140,408 men and non-commissioned officers, 5,083 officers, and 28 generals. The equipment captured consisted of 75 aircraft, 307 tanks and self-propelled guns, 1,427 guns, 557 mortars, 3,879 machine guns, 52,887 rifles and submachine guns, 219 armoured personnel carriers, 4,281 motor vehicles, and 14,056 horses. The total number of men taken prisoner from Army Group Courland was 189,112 Germans, including 42 generals, and approximately 14,000 Latvians. A German NCO named Friedrich Werner, captured at Liepaja on May 10, 1945, described the march east in a memoir written decades later. They walked for 3 days before reaching the first collection point. Men who fell out of the column were left where they fell. At the first camp, there was no food for 4 days. Werner counted the men in his section each morning. After 2 weeks, there were 11 left from 22. He did not know what had happened to the others. Some had been separated and taken to different facilities. Some had died. Some he had seen die, and some he had not. He spent the next 9 years in camps across the Soviet Union before being repatriated to West Germany in 1954. He said when he arrived at the border crossing that he had forgotten what a country that was not a camp looked like. He said it took him several years to stop checking the perimeter of every room he entered. Of the approximately 203,000 troops of Army Group Courland who began to be moved to Soviet prison camps in May 1945, the majority never returned to Germany. The bulk were taken to camps in the Valdai Hills. German officers were turned over to the NKVD. The last German prisoners from Courland were released by the Soviet Union in 1955, 10 years after the surrender. For the Latvian soldiers, the situation was more immediately lethal. Those taken prisoner by the Soviets were processed as traitors to the Soviet state rather than prisoners of war. Officers were executed. Soldiers were sentenced to the Gulag on charges of collaboration with the fascist occupiers, which was the Soviet term for fighting in the only army that was willing to fight for Latvia against the force that had deported their families. Of the approximately 50,000 Latvians who died in the war, or its aftermath, a significant portion died in Soviet captivity in the years after the fighting ended. Approximately 14,000 Latvians did not surrender at all. When the German units around them laid down their weapons in May 1945, these men picked up their rifles and walked into the forests. They were former soldiers of the 15th and 19th Divisions, former police battalion men, civilians who had been in hiding from Soviet reoccupation since 1944, and a smaller number who had simply decided they would rather die in a Latvian forest than in a Soviet camp. The Latvians called them Major Brāļi, the Forest Brothers. They were not a small group. The number of active Forest Brother combatants in Latvia peaked at between 10,000 and 15,000. The total number of resistance fighters associated with the movement was as high as 40,000. In some 3,000 raids between 1945 and 1956, the partisans attacked uniformed Soviet military personnel, Communist Party officials, and the infrastructure of Soviet occupation. The camps they built in the forests were sophisticated. In early 1945, the camp at Stompaki Swamp housed 350 to 360 people, including 40 to 50 women, with 24 residential bunkers, a bakery, a church bunker, and 3 above-ground rails for horses. On the 2nd and 3rd of March 1945, this single camp was attacked by 483 NKVD troops and local collaborators. The battle lasted the entire first day. On the night of the 3rd of March, the 350 partisans managed to break out and retreat to other locations. The NKVD hunted them systematically. Mass deportations in 1949, Operation Pryboy, removed 42,000 Latvians from their homes in a single weekend in March 1949, specifically to cut the Forest Brothers off from the civilian population that was sheltering and feeding them. School children were sometimes taken directly from school to the trains. Women and children under 16 constituted 73% of the deportees. The strategy worked. By the early 1950s, most Forest Brother units had been destroyed, captured, or dispersed. By the late 1940s, Western intelligence services were attempting to support the resistance. Britain's MI6, the American CIA, and Swedish intelligence all ran operations to keep the Forest Brothers supplied and in contact with the outside world. The most significant of these was MI6's Operation Jungle. It was compromised almost entirely by Kim Philby, the senior British intelligence officer who had been a Soviet agent since the 1930s. Philby passed details of Baltic intelligence operations directly to Moscow. The KGB used his information to identify, infiltrate, and eliminate Forest Brother units across all 3 Baltic states. Agents sent by the British to make contact with resistance networks were walking into Soviet ambushes before they reached their contacts. The operation was blown. The Forest Brothers were left without outside support, in shrinking numbers in forests that were being systematically combed by NKVD troops, backed by aircraft, local informants, and the full coercive apparatus of the Soviet state. A few held on, some surrendered under amnesty offers after Stalin's death in 1953, some were captured in the late 1950s, isolated individuals kept hiding into the 1960s and 1970s, unable or unwilling to come out. The last known Forest Brother was a Latvian man named Jānis Panups. He had gone to the forest in 1945 as a member of a resistance organisation called Don't Serve the Occupying Army. He never obtained a Soviet passport. His legal status did not exist during the era of Soviet occupation. He was invisible to the state he was hiding from for 49 years. In 1994, 3 years after Latvia restored its independence, a new passport of the Republic of Latvia was issued to Jānis Panups. He had said he was waiting for a moment when he could again see Riga as the capital of an independent Latvia. Around 80,000 soldiers from the Courland fighting are still in the ground in western Latvia. The forests and swamps that absorbed 7 months of combat have not given most of them up. In July 2019, a search team exhumed 66 soldiers from a single forest in Blidīn parish. The Saldus German Soldiers Cemetery covers 8 hectares of Latvian farmland and contains the remains of approximately 25,000 German soldiers and Latvian legionnaires whose bodies were recovered. The rest are still out there. The last German soldier in the Courland pocket surrendered on May 22, 1945. The war had been over for 14 days. And that brings today's video to an end. Thank you so much for watching, and especially if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow and allows me to continue creating these videos, so I hope you'll join me again for the next one. Until then, thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.